Mondays with Mike, it's Monday, and I'm Mike, and so I'm obligated to do Mondays with Mike. But I'm happy to do it today because I posted on my Facebook page. I said, hey, look, I want to answer some of your questions because, I try to come up with a topic every week to talk about. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult, to be honest with you, or I have this fear that I'm getting boring or something like that, or really nobody's interested. But, if it's hurricane season or something, it's a little different. But a lot of times what I talk about is sort of more what's on my mind, what I found interesting that week. And it might not be necessarily that interesting to everybody. So what I did was I asked for your questions, and I got some great ones. I was reading through these. I'm like, oh, okay, that's good. I'm going to have to look that up. Or some of them were like thought-provoking. So the first question that we have is from Kristen. And Kristen is asking about something that's on the minds of a lot of you out there, and it is the heavy pollen season over? And so the answer to that is no, it isn't, but it's more nuanced than that. So let's talk about it. So when we talk about pollen, there are lots of different pollens that we can measure in the air. And by we, I do not measure it, okay? We get our measurements from the City of Houston Health Department. There are some other entities that measure pollen depending on what part of the state you're in or what part of the country you're in. But we get daily reports from them, and I trust it. So depending on what kind of pollen you're talking about, we may be moving out of one season and into another one. So for example, right now, you're probably referring, Kristen, to oak pollen. And oak pollen is, really exploded last week. We had some of the highest levels that we've had in recent memory, really. Pollen is measured in particles per cubic meter, which is really difficult to imagine. But, big cube that big, how many of these pieces of pollen are in there? And last week, the oak pollen was up to about 10,000 parts per cubic meter. Today, it's like 1,500, which, by the way, is still considered extremely high. But last week was crazy. Now, generally, whenever we get rain, like, most of us had rain at the end of last week. Some had heavy rain and some didn't have as heavy rain. But nevertheless, that does clean the air temporarily. So it'll knock down the pollen. It'll knock down dust. Even sometimes if you have smoke in the air, it'll knock down the smoke. So we have seen a very slight improvement, but it's still pretty bad. So in terms of oak pollen, March and April are the seasons for oak pollen. It looks like maybe we had kind of an early bloom this year. If that's the case, then maybe it'll start to get a little bit better, but I wouldn't put that Claritin or Allegra away just yet. Depending on what you're allergic to, there are different pollens that peak at different times of the year. Like grass pollen bothers a lot of people too, and that doesn't peak until the summertime, like late spring and into the summer. So we got that coming our way. Ragweed season hits in the fall. Usually ragweed starts like late August and then goes September, October, November, and then will last until our first frost. That's the rule of thumb, is that once you hit 32 degrees, it kind of cuts everything off as far as the ragweed is concerned. So we have a good solid 3 months of ragweed season. And of course, it varies a little bit from year to year, but that bothers a lot of people too. We have another season that is nasty, which is cedar pollen. And that tends to blow in on a breeze, either a west wind or a northwest wind that pulls in like from the Austin area or from like the Waco area, like up around that part of like central Texas. Pulls in some cedar, and that generally is actually in the wintertime, like the mid to late part of the winter. So it really can move in, and even in like January or February, you could have a lot of cedar pollen, or during March as well, but I think it's usually a little bit before then. So is pollen season over? No, we're just switching to a different kind of pollen. So it's always something, right? If you really want the least amount of pollen, the best time is probably December and January. I would say those are probably the best, except for cedar pollen, but you don't have oak, you don't really have grass pollen at all. And depending on how much it rains, you don't have mold. Oh, that's the last one, is mold. Mold can happen any time of the year, and it's related largely to recent rainfall and things like that. So, yeah, it can happen any time of the year. All right, so Garetto asks, this is a great question. So, how did our current annual rainfall affect the water table? Is it enough to replenish it? So, referring to, under the ground, you have water. And if the water under the ground gets too low, then you lose your reservoir of drinking water and things like that. So, it has come up considerably. So, I was actually looking at the data. I went and I looked at the Barker Reservoir, and they do take measurements, and it's up 10 inches this year. So I know it doesn't sound like much, but it kind of is. So a 10-inch rise keeps the water table high, and gives available drinking water and things like that. And some people have like well water. Like if you live out in unincorporated areas, you kind of need the water table to be high. So that rose. Also, Lake Houston is the water supply. Most of the municipal water supply for the city of Houston is taken from Lake Houston. And that one is up as well. So I think for the year, let's see, did I write it down here? Let's see, Lake Houston is up 1.5 feet so far this year. So yeah, we're definitely moving in the right direction there. And let's see, yeah. So we're moving in the right direction. Okay, next is a great question and somewhat controversial. This is from Jamie, who said, okay, my question, a few years ago, not sure exactly when, a new satellite was put into orbit that was supposed to help with forecasting hurricanes and other weather conditions. Do you feel that the new satellite has helped improve weather forecasts? And do you know if any more are planned soon? Excellent, excellent question. So, and it's actually quite a soap opera of an answer. So, back in the year 2018, NOAA launched a new satellite, which was going to replace, so we have these satellites called GOES. GOES stands for Geostationary Operational Environmental Satellite, GOES. So you have a GOES East and a GOES West. So GOES East covers the Atlantic Ocean and most of the country, but mostly the Atlantic Ocean in the US. And then GOES West covers the Pacific Ocean and the west coast of the US. So we have some overlapping coverage, but you really do need both to keep an eye on what's happening. So, and then there are other satellites around the world. The European Space Agency has one. The Japanese have one. Chinese have them. So there are quite a few, but ours cover our part of the world. So the GOES 17 was launched in 2018. But guess what happened? So I remember when this happened. So it was in orbit. They got it set up, and then they switched over to the new one. Well, all of a sudden we would get these breaks, like you'd get a satellite loop, and like almost at the same time every day, it would just kind of like go kaput, and then would come back online after a couple of hours. It turns out that there was a problem with the cooling system on this satellite. These satellites are pretty big. I mean, it's kind of like a car, maybe I think a little bit bigger, like a big F-150 or something. And they're loaded with a lot of different what we call imagers. An imager is really a fancy name for a camera, but like some of them see like your regular camera with your naked eye. Some of them look at infrared. Some of them look at different, some of them look at UV light coming from the sun. I mean, there's different imagers. Well, anyway, the main one was not being cooled down. Wherever the cooling system was basically broke, malfunctioned, can't be fixed. So how many millions of dollars did that cost? I'm sure many. But the bottom line is it didn't work. The old one that it was set to replace was getting near the end of its life. So they needed to launch a new one. So they did launch the GOES T, which replaced the GOES West. So is it online yet? I think so. I think that one went online in 22 or 23. So anyway, that's one. The other one was set to be replaced also. The GOES 19, which is like another advanced satellite, was sent up, and here's why I'm so glad you asked the question. I should have said this at first. The new one for the East Coast is supposed to go online this Friday. So it's actually been there in space for 3 years. I think it was launched in 2022. So it's been up there for 3 years. It takes it that long for them to place it where they want it and for them to start downloading the data and, you know what I mean, working out whatever kinks need to be worked out. I don't know. That's beyond my level of expertise. But the bottom line is it is supposed to go online, and we're supposed to start getting the data from this satellite on Friday, on April the 4th. So that's kind of cool. So you asked a great question. Has it made hurricane forecasting better? Has it helped with weather forecasting? I think the answer is we don't know yet because it just hasn't been up there for long enough. I would say long term, it's got to help because it's going to give us a higher resolution view of the atmosphere, and all of that data will get fed into the computer models. It's got to make it better. But I just don't know yet because even though it was launched a while ago, it hasn't been brought online yet. So, but that's a great question. It's a great question. All right. Moving on to Jessica says, why have there been so many tornadoes in the United States so far this year? And you're correct. You're definitely correct to observe. So I looked it up. So far this year, we had a couple this morning too, at least one in Mississippi. There was one in Louisiana also that was to the north and west. It was like between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. So I would say right now the approximate number of tornadoes, 290 so far this year. And I say approximate because as of yesterday, there were 288, and I think there have been at least 2 today. So 290 or so this year. Last year, there were 227 to this date, to the end of March. There were 227. The year before that, there were only 56. So there's a lot of natural variability. And as far as why there have been so many this year, it's been related to the same reason why it's been pretty windy this year. You notice it's been windy, right? We've had several more windy days than you would expect. There's been a very bumpy jet stream, a lot of ups and downs, and that's resulted in some weather extremes across like the Midwest. Like if you look at states like, not that we talk about it very often, right? But Iowa, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Michigan. These are spots that have had several rounds of some windstorms and blizzards and late season snow and a lot of things going on in that part of the country. And those areas of low pressure have been the ones that have increased our wind and the reason why we've been so windy. And that actually leads into why there have been so many tornadoes, because when the wind at the ground comes in really strong, like from south to north, it meets up with air that's twisting in the upper parts of the atmosphere, and you get what's called wind shear, directional wind shear. And so that's one of the things that contributes to tornadoes. And so you have to think about it, though, like we have different numbers of hurricanes each year, too. So there's always going to be this kind of natural variability. Some years we have 13 tropical storms, and some years we have 22 tropical storms, and then one year we might have 12. So there is natural variability in the number of these things. But yes, no doubt, you're right. There have been more tornadoes this year than we've seen in the past. And a lot of them in parts of the Deep South, too. Like today, we had one in Louisiana, one in Mississippi, and maybe more later on today. Okay, so Gabriella asks a question about wildfires, and she asks, why are there continuous fires in California? How is climate change affecting California and the fires that they're having? Are the fires that they're having typical for California, or is it just because there's more media that we know about them? Well, this is a deep question, and I think that all of the things you mentioned are true. They each play a part. So yes, we're seeing more media coverage now. Yes, climate change is probably playing a role. Don't get mad at me. I'm just, look, this is not me. This is what the scientists are saying. This is what the experts are saying. Also, California, more than almost any other state, is prone to forest fires. Way more than Texas. Way more than, even places like Colorado or other states that have, mountainous areas. So California, when you look at, when you think California, you think Los Angeles, or you maybe think San Francisco. But most of the state is very, very wooded. There's a lot of forest land in California. I'm not an expert on California, but you have like this big central valley where they grow a lot of food, and that area is not forested. But a lot of the mountain areas, the northern part of the state is like all kind of wetland kind of forest, like almost like cold rainforest kind of. I don't know if that's technically the term for it, but like it's the Pacific Northwest, like Oregon and Washington State. It's wet most of the time. Southern California has a very dry climate. They call it a Mediterranean climate. So it is pretty dry, and they get most of their rain during the wintertime. Some years they get a lot of rain, and some years they get very little rain. And this past year, they had a lot of rain in 2023, and then not that much in 2024, I think. That was what they called like the rainfall whiplash, where they had a lot of rain one year and then almost no rain the next year, and it messed up the cycle of the trees. So they got unusually dry. I will tell you, though, that one of the contributing factors is carelessness, that these fires, from what it seems like over recent years, have been caused by humans. So there was a big round of wildfires a few years ago that was caused by downed power lines from Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E. I don't know if you remember them talking about that. So PG&E actually ended up getting sued, and I don't know if they went bankrupt or almost bankrupt from having to pay the state, billions of dollars. This last one, I don't know exactly what caused it, but it looks like it was arson or at least careless activity. And if you want to know something interesting, look up Johnny Cash. Yeah, the Man in Black. Johnny Cash is responsible for starting a giant wildfire in California. I think it was in the 60s, 50s or 60s. It was like when he ended up in prison, right? So he was just one of the many examples of what Smokey the Bear tells you, which is that only you can prevent forest fires. So are the fires worse than before? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have the data on all that, but I'll tell you that obviously we get a lot more coverage of it now, and the odds are that they will be getting worse, or that they are getting more frequent. Sabrina, do you think we're going to have a very hot summer? Yes. That's an easy answer. Yes. John, if you go to you have to kind of go to the Facebook page to appreciate this, but he says, we saw the weirdest thing the other day. It was 4 lines of white stuff, kind of like what you see from jet airplanes with condensation trails that are not chemtrails. They're condensation trails. But this was like 4 of them in a row, and I looked at it and I can't figure out what it is. So I would, try to pretend. I just wrote it. I said, John, I think I'm stumped. I couldn't make heads or tails out of that one. All right. This is a great question that I get asked a lot. This is from Patricia, who says, does the extreme cold winter make things go the other extreme in the summer? And, the answer is no, not really. I did go over this a few years ago. We had a particularly cold winter, and it was okay. Well, does that mean we're going to have a hot summer? And it actually turned out that no, you usually have a cooler than normal summer. But here's the thing. Even if the summer is cooler than normal, it's still ridiculously hot. It's always going to be that way. So even if it turns out to be a little cooler than normal, it's still going to be hot. So does it make the temperature swing around and get hotter than average in the summer? The answer is not necessarily. We'll say no, there's no big correlation between the two. Still roughly 50-50. Okay, so Dara asks, how has the Farmers Almanac been created all these years, even before modern technology? The Farmers Almanac is fun. I mean, the Farmers Almanac goes back to like the days of like George Washington and Ben Franklin and these guys. It goes back to the late 1700s. And there are a lot of old folk ways to predict if it's going to be cold. They would use like caterpillars, like depending on what time all kind of different things, right? I'll tell you this, that the Farmer's Almanac started out with all these old ways of trying to predict, cycles and things like that. Like you can try to come up with cycles. A lot of it might have to do with El Nino, La Nina, but there are cycles where maybe you get, like a 3 to 7 year kind of cycle of things like snowfall and temperatures and things, it's really, really hard to predict. See, here's the thing. So from what I read online about the Farmers Almanac is that their accuracy is roughly 50-50. So if they say it's going to be an unusually cold winter, they're right about half the time. So, what does that tell you, right? I will say that these days, getting one of those almanacs, and there are two of them because they're rivals. There's the old Farmers Almanac, and then there's like the such and such, some other Farmers Almanac. They have been updated, and so they use a lot of new information, like when it comes to things like the lunar cycles and sunspots and hurricane season forecasts. They do include a lot of new stuff in there. So even though it is called the Old Farmer's Almanac, it's not based on stuff from the 1700s anymore. It's been updated. So, but it's a cool thing. It's a cool thing to have, really. There's some good information in there. Rachel says, do you think it's going to be a big flood year? Hard to say. I will tell you that our greatest risk for flooding occurs pretty much the month we're going into, April and May and June. So April, May, June are the months where we get, on average, the heaviest rain. Of course, Hurricane Harvey flooded us in September. We can flood any time of the year, but we get our heaviest average rainfall April, May, and June. So something to keep an eye out for. Usually July and August are our driest months, unless we get hit by a hurricane. Mike says, good name, Mike. Great question, too. The pollen counts last week were historically high. What caused this huge upsurge we wouldn't see otherwise? Well, I'll tell you, I agree with you. From what I've seen, so I did mention this at the beginning of the show here about those oak pollen levels that were like 10,000 parts per cubic meter, whereas most of the time it might get up to like 5,000 or 6,000. Now, I am not an arborist. I'm not a botanist. So I'd be lying if I told you I knew exactly. But I will tell you that let's see, did I tell this to, I forgot who I told this to. Maybe it was Lena. But it was like, I was comparing it to like wine and certain, how people collect wines or whatever, and like certain years are supposed to be better for certain wines than others. And it had to do with how much rain fell that year, if it was dry, if it was whatever. It affects the flavor of the grapes for people who can taste that much. I can't. But people can tell the difference between, this is a Bordeaux from 2022 or a Bordeaux from 2019 or whatever, because some years are better than others. And it has to do with how much rain fell that year and what the temperatures were and everything. And all trees are the same. So some years you're going to have a longer growth season. For oak trees, some years they're going to bloom more than others. This year, maybe it had to do with the couple of freezes that we had. We did have 2 deep freezes, one in June and then, June, yeah, right. One in July with the snow and then one in February. So we have had some deep freezes this year, and then we've had some very warm days. Maybe it's that variability. I don't know for a fact, but I'll tell you that every plant, whether it's wine grapes or oak trees or bluebonnets, the bluebonnets, remember, they don't come out at like the exact same day every year. They come out at slightly different times in the spring based on what the weather was like leading up to that. So if you think about it that way, it kind of makes sense that some years are going to be better than others. All right, I have to take a quick break. I'll be right back to answer Gina's question because it's an awesome question. This question is so good. Gina said, why does barometric pressure cause headaches? And it's related to a question that I'm going to include it in, from Allison, who said, please explain how low pressure systems induce labor. I learned that in Natchez, Mississippi, 23 years ago, Tropical Storm Isidore came in. And is that why they don't want you to fly in your 3rd trimester? So I looked this up, and there's a few reasons that this might be true, and then a few reasons why it might be like kind of a little voodoo. So you do have air inside your body, like in your sinuses and your ears and things like that, like back here, which is why people get sinus headaches and stuff when the pressure changes. So that is probably what contributes to people having headaches, is just the difference in air pressure between some of these air that's in these pockets in your bones, behind your face. That's probably what causes that. Also, your ears. If your pressure changes in your ears, then your ears can start to pop. Or if it's like a really gradual change, maybe your ears don't pop, and relieve that pressure. And so that can lead to headaches. Which, by the way, though, but what I don't understand is then you should also get headaches if you take an airplane ride or go up in an elevator. You should also get headaches. It's definitely a thing. No doubt it is a thing. All right, and then as far as, this is actually just a really interesting question that I had to do some research on this morning, and it was Allison's question about labor, about, do women go into labor more during storms? And I got some really interesting perspectives from different sources across the internet, including, like, I tried to get some real sources like doctors and stuff. And the labor and delivery nurses say that they do see a correlation for when there are, tropical storms and hurricanes or thunderstorms, that they tend to see more women go into labor. Now, like I said, I'm not a doctor and I don't want to get too gross about it, but there are some membranes in there that can break when there are differences, when there's a drop in air pressure, according to the doctors. So that may be part of it. There also is sort of some anecdotal evidence that maybe it's just the stress of a hurricane coming and hitting that sort of makes women go into labor. But there may be a physical reason there with the change in air pressure causing a bursting or a pressure on, some of the, you ladies know all the stuff. So I don't want to get too deep into it, but but it's a thing. It does appear to actually be a thing. And finally, last question is from Faith, who said, do cumulus clouds cause air turbulence? Well, they're one and the same. The rising air, and then once it goes up, it kind of does one of these things. And that's what you'll feel as turbulence, after you take off from Bush Airport or Hobby or whatever. And so the cumulus clouds are there as a result of the rising air. And then once the air rises, it kind of creates these eddies like that. And when you fly through those, that's wind shear and it creates a very bumpy ride. So the pilots try to avoid that kind of stuff. So anyway, this has been fun. You guys asked such good questions, and it made me think. It was way more interesting than me just doing 25 minutes on pollen levels or something, because I actually got a chance to answer some of your great questions. So I want to thank all of you, seriously. Anybody whose question I got a chance to answer, I want to thank you for taking part, and maybe we could do this every once in a while. So anyway, hope you have a great day. I want to give a shout out to my mom and Neil down in Florida, and I hope you all are doing great down there. We'll see you soon. My girls are graduating in 2 months. 2 months, in fact, 2 months from today. Two of my 3 girls are graduating from high school. Isn't that crazy? Crazy. At least